Alright, so last time we finished out sort of blocking out the neck, and we ended up with something that looks a little bit like this. So let's finish up this neck so that we can, get towards finishing the rest of the guitar. And what we want to get to is something that looks a little bit like this. And just quickly, the other thing I did after the last video is I just renamed some of these things, like the nut and the frets, and moved them into the guitar folders so that things are a little bit more organized. And so this is one of the parts I think that probably trips up most people when they try to build out shapes like this, because the sort of smooth transition here between the sort of rounded portion of the neck and the headstock is a little bit tricky to get right. So we're gonna do that. So to get started here, I just went on to Google Images and did a quick search for a picture of a headstock, and I brought in this one here, and I just rotated it so that it was roughly angled the same as the headstock here. It doesn't matter what headstock shape you pick; you can do whatever you want with this. I went with this one just because it's a pretty simple shape. It's not too complicated, and you just want to find one that has a really clear sort of head-on picture of the headstock to use as a reference. So I'm gonna use this one just because it's pretty square, but you can pick whatever you like. Try and pick something that is interesting to you. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to have to sort of square this off, and part of the reason that that's going to be a challenge is because if I go into edit mode here, you can see that right now we've got some sort of our topology is running straight up the neck and along all the way to the end of the headstock, and the back of this is currently rounded. So we need to square that off. But if we do that, if we add loop cuts here to try and straighten any of this, it's also going to affect the neck, right? So we don't want this sharp line running down the back of the neck. We only want the headstock to be squared off. So to make this a little easier, the first thing I'm going to do is separate this off so that it's its own object. And I'm just going to grab this loop cut here and just EF to straighten it. There we go. And then I'm going to alt click to select that, and then shift click to select the whole thing, and then I'm going to hit P and selection. So this is going to separate it into its own separate object, and then we can just sort of work on that and then worry about joining the two later on. All right, so let's make this a little more square. So to square this off, we need a loop cut here to bring up to the top like that, and we also need to square up these edges. So I'm just gonna highlight this in X-ray mode and grab this set of middle edges here and just bring it out so it's sort of overlapping the ones here at the end. And I'll do the same with the ones here at the bottom, just like that. There we go. And actually you can highlight these and hit SX0, or sorry, SY0, and that'll center them in the Y-axis, and SZ0 to center them in the X if you want them to all overlay perfectly. So I'll do that here, SZ0, SY0, and do the same with this. There we go. And so now that's nice and straight, but it's still not rectangular, and it's because we have a subsurf modifier applied to this at the same level as we did on the neck, and we need to add more loop cuts to this to make it straight. Quickly before we do that though, I'm just gonna hide this and look at what's going on here from the front. So these are also not straight, so I'm just gonna grab this and just GZ, and then these ones I'll highlight both, and then SX to scale in the X. And I see that screencast keys has turned off again. Is it working? There we go. Sorry about that. And then this, again, just GZ, highlight these, and SX. There we go. And it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but you want to get it sort of approximately right. And then this, I'll just drag it here until it's in roughly the correct position with our with respect to our side profile of the neck. There we go. So now we need a loop cut here, here, and here. There we go. And now you can see we've got that nice rectangular profile that we wanted. Now in order to join this to the rest of the neck, we have a bit of a problem here in that we've added more geometry. So we have loop cuts here now that we've added here that we haven't added down here. So if I go into edit mode and just alt click to select this, down here you can see that this has 16 verts. And if you don't have this where it says the number of verts here, just right click this bottom edge and enable scene statistics, and it'll turn that on. And if I click the neck down here and alt click to select this, we only have 10, right? So we need to add 6 more verts, or 3 loop cuts in this case, because it'll be 1 vert on either side. So let's do that. So we're going to add 1 on each side like this, and then 1 here in the middle. So that's 3 loop cuts, 6 verts, so this should now also have 16. But that has also changed the shape of this a little bit. So what you want to do is just alt-click this and this, and then I'm going to go into side view and control-click to deselect everything except the ones that are sort of here at the center of the neck. And then just from the top, I'm just going to GY to drag this out and just make it a little bit more rounded. So we don't want a V-shaped profile here. We want this to be nice and round. And that's looking a little bit better. Maybe SX to scale those out in the X a little bit, and then I'll do the same thing here. So SX just to scale out a little bit, and just try and make this so that it is keeping that rounded profile here that we want. So that's looking pretty nice and round, and something like that's probably fine. And again, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but you just want to adjust them so that they look about as good as you can get it. There we go. That's looking pretty good. So now that these both have the same number of verts on either of these loops at the ends, we can bridge between these two. And essentially, that's going to add the geometry that will form the transition between the headstock and the neck. So I'm going to select one and then the other, Control J to join. So these are now one object. And actually, just before I do that, I'm actually just going to GZ to drag this up just a hair. Or actually, maybe I'll bring this loop cut down a hair. It's probably better. There we go. Just so there's a little bit of space between them. And then Control J to join, and then Tab to enter edit mode, and I'm going to Alt-click to select this loop, Alt-Shift-click to select this loop, and then search for bridge edge loops. And when you bridge, it will add all of the geometry to form the transition. Now you'll notice the transition doesn't look particularly smooth, so we are going to fix that. We have 2 edge loops here, just from before. I'm just going to dissolve one of them. Just Alt-click and then X, dissolve edges, just to ease that sharp transition up a little bit. And this is looking a little bit better now. And now let's go ahead and shape the headstock itself. So I have my reference image here. Your reference image might be a different one. Doesn't really matter. You know exactly how it looks, but I'm gonna go with this shape here. So with this reference image in front, but not selectable. So I've disabled it here using the filters. And then I'm gonna select the neck behind it, and then tab into edit mode, and I'm I'm just going to grab these verts here at the top and SX to scale so it is roughly correct. And then down here for the ones in the center, I'm just going to Control R to add a loop cut and position it about where that sort of this angular transition happens, and then SX to scale that appropriately. And because that is not quite looking sharp enough here, because we've got the subsurf applied with quite a few levels, I'm just going to add a proximity loop with Control R and just drag it down here like that, just to sort of make that hold that edge there. There we go. And I might even bring it down a little further, just so it's a little bit sharper. And that's looking pretty all right. So we can get rid of our reference image here. And then this, I still think this transition is looking okay, but not as good as it should. So I'm just going to go in and manually adjust some of these verts. And I'm going to make sure that if I'm selecting one on the left side, that I'm also selecting it on the right, just so that I'm editing both sides equally. You could also delete half of it and use a mirror modifier. That would be fine as well. But I'm just going to select one on each side here, and then GG to edge slide, and just smooth out this transition here a little bit. And for these ones here, select these two and just SX to scale them in a little bit. There we go. And something like that is a little smoother. Maybe these corners I could just go into top mode here, and it's a little hard to see, but just bring them in a little bit, just so that gets a little bit more rounded here. And that's looking a lot better, I think. That's a much cleaner transition. Different guitars have different types of transitions from the neck to the headstock. So something like this is not uncommon. You will also see different types as well, but this is fine. All right, so there we go. So there's our headstock shape, and it does look like it's not quite matching our side reference because we're using multiple different reference photos here. So I'm just gonna grab this here, and I'm just gonna scale it a little like this, and just make sure that it sort of lines up with that reference, and that's looking pretty okay. All right, so now let's make some side dots and some dots for the fretboard. So I'm just going to take this neck outline and hide it for now, and then our actual neck object, I'm just gonna call it neck, and put it in the guitar folder here. That way we can work on making the dots. Now the dots for the fretboard don't need to be part of the fretboard geometry. You can make them separately, and that'll just make the topology of this a lot cleaner. So it's not necessary for those to actually be a part of the fretboard itself. So I'm just going to go Shift A mesh, and circle, and I'll give this maybe, I don't know, 12 divisions. We can subdivide it if we need it to be smoother. And I'm going to scale it down, RX 90 to rotate it towards us, and GY, and then tab to enter edit mode, and then F to fill. And so this is going to become one of the fretboard dots. So I'll just shade it smooth and scale it down, and GZ to put it roughly in position here at the 3rd fret. Now these do range in size a little bit. I did some research to just sort of figure out exactly how large these should be. And I actually came up with quite a few different sizes. So I'm going to go with 6 millimeters, because that seems like a fairly average size. That is somewhere in the middle of the range. And GY to just put it here. And if you want this to stick to the fretboard, one thing you could do is in the modifiers tab, look for shrink wrap modifier, and then under target, just select the where is it, the fretboard here as your object, and then the offset I'm going to set to 0.001, and it is actually maybe even 0.001 is better, and it's just sort of stuck there, right? It's pretty much just right on top of it. Maybe even I'll go a little closer. There we go. And that's one way that you can do decals inside of Blender. So if you want to, have, well, maybe make this a little more so the clipping doesn't mess it up. But if you wanted to have like a sticker on a wine bottle or something, that's just a pretty useful trick. Now it does look a little octagonish, like it doesn't quite have as many sides as, it looks a little bit jagged, so I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier just to sort of make that a little bit more smooth. And something like that. And there is just a very, very minute space between this and the fretboard. You just want to make sure that it is far enough away, and I ended up with a distance of 0.00007 meters, so less than a millimeter by quite a bit. And you just want to make sure that there's no Z fighting, which is when two faces are like right on top of one another, you'll get sort of weird artifacting, and it's because it's not sure which face to display, essentially, because they're too close on top of one another. So something like this should be okay. All right, now one more thing is the dots on a fretboard are not actually white. They are kind of, but in reality, they are made of mother of pearl. And we're going to make a mother of pearl material because that's sort of a really interesting challenge in Blender. It's sort of a unique material, but you can see it's sort of iridescent. It's not quite white. It's reflective, but it also has this sort of like pinkish and bluish and greenish hues depending on the angle that you look at it from. So I didn't make this material. It was made by a person on blenderartist.org. Quite a while ago, and it's CC0, which means that it's essentially it's almost like public domain. It's free for commercial use. It's free for pretty much whatever you want to use it for. So I will leave a link in the description. And what it is it's a node group. So the way that you'll add it is to go File, Append, and then you're going to search for the file. In my case, it's this one called pearlmat.blend, and the blend file to download is in the thread that's in the description of this video. And then you're going to go node tree pearl, and then when you come in here to your material, so I made a new material for the dots and just called it pearl. You're going to go Shift A, group, and pearl, and bring that in. And then it's actually going to replace this principled BSDF because it's its own shader. So I'm going to delete that. I'm going to plug it into the surface. And then if we go to rendered view mode, let's see if we can have a look at it so you can sort of see. Now one thing is that the scale is not quite right, I think. And that's just because we're working with such a small object. So to fix this, under this pearl, currently it has a scale value of 5. That scale is used for displacement, but I'm going to edit it manually. So with the node group selected, hit Tab to enter it, and I'm just going to unplug this scale from here, from the group input. And then there's this texture coordinate node, but there's no mapping node. So I'm going to add a mapping node with Shift A, search mapping. I'm going to plug one here, and then Shift D to duplicate it, and one down here. And I'm not going to be using the displacement, but it's just a good idea to set this up correctly for both. And the scale, I'm going to plug into the scale value of both of these mapping nodes. There we go. And that's all we have to do. So tab to exit, and then if I set the scale to 1, might be a little hard to see. Maybe it'll be easier in Eevee. Let's see. And you can see it's sort of like a little bit glossy. Like it's sort of a glossy material. It's not just sort of reflective. And if you look at it from an angle, it might be hard to see here without actually doing a full render. But there's sort of like a little bit of mottled sort of greenish, pinkish, bluish hues going on here that I can clearly see on my monitor. That I don't know how well it'll come through in the recording. But it is a pretty subtle effect. For the dots, it doesn't matter so much, but if you wanted to add like a big logo on the headstock or something, it would be a little bit more noticeable. And I am going to add a logo to the headstock here towards the end. All right, so that's the material for the dot. I'm just going to select this actually and apply the shrink wrap, and then tab and then extrude. And I'm going to add a loop cut here near the top, and also I'm just going to inset this face a little bit. And then GY to just drag it in, rotate it. Just because I wasn't super happy with the way that the shrink wrap was working. So this is, the shrink wrap helped us get it into the position, but this should probably look a little bit better in the actual render. All right, so now let's duplicate these. So the frets go at 3, 5, 7, 9. So 3, Shift D to duplicate, and then grab it and just move one down here. So that's 5. This will be 7. And then we have 2 of them at the 12th fret. So I'm going to Shift D, GZ, and bring it all the way down to the 12th fret. There we go. And for this, I'm going to leave the origin point where it is. So into edit mode. By the way, if you go into edit mode and you drag around, it'll leave the origin point where it is. Whereas if you're in object mode, it'll drag the origin point with it when you grab and move. So tab into edit mode, A to select all, and then GX, and just drag it over slightly in the X. And the reason I'm doing that is so that I can easily mirror it. So I'm going to add a mirror modifier to this, and then hit apply. And so now we have 2 dots there instead of 1. So then we need one more at the 15th fret. So I'll grab this one up here, Shift D, GZ, 15th fret. There we go. And the 17th. So Shift D, GZ, and just position it here at the 17th. There we go. And so now I'm just going to join them all so that it's a little bit cleaner. So I'll just Shift click all of these different dot layers, Control J to join them all, and just actually drag this one out a little bit more, just a hair. And I'm going to call this fretboard dots. Perfect. Now let's do the same with the side dots. So there are also dots on the side of the neck. And the way that I'm going to do this is Shift A, mesh, and let's add a cylinder. And we're going to reduce the verts. Actually, let's leave it at 32. We're doing a pretty high poly guitar here, and this will save us from having to do any subsurf on this object. So just click it and shade smooth, scale it down, RY90 to rotate it this way, and then we're just going to keep scaling it down, and then SX to scale it up like this. There we go. And now for this, the way that we're going to do this is I need to actually check the diameter of this. So these should be 2.38 millimeters. So I'm just going to, again, scale. Let's actually apply rotation and scale. And scale it. And it's S and Shift X to scale it in every axis except X. And then Shift and drag just to scale it until it is 2.3, did I say 2.38 millimeters? So 0.00238 meters. There we go. And then tab, and what I'm also going to do here is just Smart UV project. Now that and actually we should apply the rotation and scale, and then I'm just going to apply that pearl material to it. So I called it pearl. So there we go. You can see it's got more of a sort of a pearl-like texture to it than just default white, which is this. And then tab to add a loop cut here. There we go, and into face mode and inset this face. Just the same thing that we did with the dots on the top here, just to make it sort of very nice and sharp. And I'm going to scale it down in the x-axis and just position it here so that it's barely sticking out of the fretboard on one side, because these are typically only on one side of the fretboard, so the side that would be facing upwards. Yeah, so then we'll center this here, and just so that it's there properly, and GY just to put it in the middle here. There we go. And there's our side dot. So now we'll duplicate this all the way down the neck for each of these positions. And then when we get down here to the 12th fret, usually it's got two dots instead of one. So I'm just gonna position one like here on top of these dots, and Shift D, GZ to put one underneath as well, and then Control J to merge them, and GX to just drag these out. And I'll just drag this one out a little bit more than the other one. And center these like so. And we'll continue down to the rest of the neck. And I'm not sure when this happened, but one thing I just noticed is that my body's a little bit displaced. I'm just going to select all of this, including the braces and the pins and everything, and just GY to drag it back a little bit like that. There we go. And I just realized what the problem is that that edit that I did earlier in the video, where we sort of domed out the front, I didn't actually save it in my file, so I'm just going to redo that quickly. And I'm actually just going to refine the geometry of this transition a little bit as well. I'm just going to drag this up and drag this in a little bit, make the headstock just a little bit more narrow, just because it looks a little fat like that. And the headstock does taper, but maybe not quite that much. There we go. All right, so this is looking pretty good. This is, let's do a quick render, because this is really starting to look like an instrument now. And just before we do that quickly, I'm gonna grab all of these side dots that we just added, and I'm just gonna Control J to merge them into a single layer and call them side dots, and put them in the folder with everything else. There we go. So that's looking pretty good. We've got a couple more things to do, so let's keep cracking. So we have 3 or 4 things left to do, and then we're done. So we got to do the strings, we got to do a head plate, we got to do the tuners, and then a logo on the head plate. So the logo, I'll probably just use the same pearl material that we just used for the dots, because typically that is what would be used anyways. And then the head plate's going to be pretty easy too, because it's just, the head plate is essentially just a duplicate of the headstock, but very thin. So let's actually start with that, because that will be really easy to do. So there are a couple different ways that you could do a head plate for this. You could actually make a physical head plate. That would be one way to do it, and that would be, you know, pretty accurate to some types of guitars. Some have them, some don't. But sometimes also just the front is sort of painted. The way that I'm going to do it, just for the sake of simplicity, is to highlight all of these faces just on the front here, and then I'm just going to Alt-Shift-click these face loops around just to make sure that I'm not selecting anything that I don't need to be. And then I'm going to also select this one here right by the edge, and then Control-click and drag to deselect any areas where I shouldn't have selected. There we go. And select these in here too. Just like that. And then I'm going to add a new material slot. I'm going to go down here under this drop-down menu and select the bridge material and hit assign. And that's just going to put a layer of rosewood over the top here like that. And you will find that that should look, if we go into rendered view, that should look pretty okay. And it's pretty common to have either a paint or a thin veneer over the headstock like this, so that should look pretty realistic. Alright, so now let's make some tuners. And the tuners, as it turns out, should be fairly straightforward to make, but they just look like they have, you know, a lot of different parts, and they do. But you can see they've got sort of a nut and then a washer underneath, and then the sort of cylindrical post sticking out of it. So we can start with that and work on the actual tuning parts afterwards. So let's make a nut and a washer, and these are actually just cylinders. And I'm just going to grab a reference photo from the internet to make these, just so that I get the scales sort of proportionally correct. Again, doesn't need to be absolutely perfect, but just to sort of be in the correct vicinity. Let's work with this, and I'm just going to hide this guitar for now. So I'll lock this and then shift A, mesh, cylinder, and we're going to give this first cylinder 6 verts, because a cylinder with 6 verts is a hexagon. So we're going to scale that down, RX90 to rotate it towards us, and then just roughly position it where it should be here. And something like that is fine. And we'll just scale it inwards and set this material to the strap pin material, which is just that metallic that we made for the strap pin earlier. They can be the same material, and that'll be fine. And then I'm just going to select this front face here and the back face as well, and I'm going to inset both of them, so I to insets. And I'm just going to scale it down roughly, you know, where it looks about like it should be, and then X and delete faces. Now there should be a circular hole in the center, so I'm going to alt-click one of these loops here, right-click, Loop Tools, Circle. And you'll notice that because this is already a hexagon, which is essentially a circle, it doesn't change. So what we need to do is to add a little bit more geometry. And you can do that pretty easily by actually just Control R, all the way around. And now when you, alt-click, right-click, Loop Tools, Circle, it'll turn it into a circle. And then we'll do the same for the back. So Loop Tools, Circle, and then alt-click, and alt-click, and then space, bridge, edge loops. And I'm going to right-click and shade smooth. And there we go. So that is our nut. So one thing you'll notice right away is that this doesn't look right. The shading on this is pretty wonky. If we shade it smooth or shade it flat, doesn't seem to matter. We can still see those edges. And so to fix this, just go down here into the object data properties, and under normals, turn on auto smooth, and it will sort of flatten out that face correctly. All right, so let's add another cylinder. So Shift A, mesh, cylinder, and this time I'm gonna give it like 24 because this is gonna be a washer, so it needs to be fairly smooth. Right click and shade smooth, scale it way down, RX90 to just rotate it, and scale it and position it roughly where it should be. Just drag these both out a little bit and give it about that size. And then I notice on the washers are sort of tapered up a little bit, so I'm just gonna bring it like this, and then alt click this top ring here and scale down a little bit, and that way it won't just be completely flat. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the washer, so I'm going to click both of these faces, I to inset, X to delete faces, and then alt-click to select these two inner edge loops, and then search for bridge edge loops. And let's give it right-click, shade smooth, and give it the same material, the strap pin. And that's looking pretty good, but if this doesn't look correct, then you can turn on auto smoothing, and that will help with that. And then the other thing is that the washers are sort of tapered in a little bit at the top, so I'm going to alt-click and just scale like this to bring this in, and then Control R to add a couple loop cuts here just to sharpen that up a little bit because it does look like it should be a little bit sharper. And I'm going to scale it down so that it's just like barely larger than the nut. All right, and so now the pin is essentially just a cylinder with you know, a little bit of a taper in the middle. So again, Shift A mesh cylinder. We'll leave this at 24, shade it smooth and scale it down, and position this roughly in the same spot. And scale it down so that it's just about that large. SY to scale. And then they sort of are like a little bit rounded in the middle, so we can do that by just adding a couple of loop cuts here, and then a couple more loop cuts, and just hit scale. There we go. And just clean this up a little bit like that. And then I'll just inset this last face in GY to bring it out a little bit like that and give it that same material as the other objects. And we'll turn on our auto smooth there, and that's looking pretty good. And just have a quick look at this in rendered view mode. Just, you always want to have a look at, you know, look at this just to see how your final render is gonna look and see if there are any issues. And I do see an issue already, which is that this nut looks like it's a little bit too low resolution for like how over the top we've gone with our other objects, and the same with this washer. So I will actually add a subsurf modifier to this, and then some loop cuts around each of these portions, just to give it that hexagonal shape back. And then I'm just gonna drag these GG just to sort of smooth out this inner ring, because otherwise the inside of this washer will still be hexagonal, or the inside of this nut, when it should actually be round. And I am just subdividing some more pieces of this just to make it look really nice. There we go, and that's looking pretty good. Now there's generally also a hole for the strings. I don't know that we necessarily need to go you know, into that level of detail here, because you're not really going to see that anyways. But if you wanted to, you could do that by just adding a boolean to non-destructively add a hole in the center of this. So you would just make a cylinder as like a subtractor or cutter object, hide it, and then set that as the subtraction object in the boolean applied to this to put a hole right down the center of it. All right, so this is looking pretty okay. Let's make the back portion of the tuners. And I'm just going to move these to a new group and call it tuners. And just hide these just to keep everything nice and organized. And there are lots of different shapes for these. Some are more complex than others. I'm just going to do a simple one, something like this, you know, which isn't too complicated of a shape. So that'll be good for what we're doing. So again, I've got a reference image open on the other page. You always want to try and work from a reference image so that you're not just sort of blindly guessing at what you're trying to make. And in fact, I will bring a reference in again here like this. So let's grab this and Shift A mesh plane, or X90, and I'm just gonna scale it like this, and I'm just gonna rotate this so that it's a little more straight, and lock it. And then for the shape of this, I'm just gonna Just gonna sort of roughly try to get a a shape approximation here. And you can do this with proportional editing if that will help, but you also don't have to. You can just sort of trace out a reference image so that it looks sort of approximately correct. And then I'm just going to E to extrude. And then I'm going to add a subsurf modifier to this and some loop cuts just to hold the geometry. And right click to shade smooth, and then I'm going to give this that same strap pin material that we used earlier. So there we've got the tuning key, and maybe I'll just sharpen this up a little bit. Something like that's probably pretty good. And let's make the rest of this. So Shift A, mesh, oops, not a circle, I want a cylinder, and scale it down, shade it smooth, and give it that same material. And we're just gonna roughly scale it. Something like that. There we go. And then the rest of this is sort of a bit of an odd shape, but I'll make it out of a plane. Just scale this like so. GZ to bring it down. And it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, and probably won't be, and that is all right. But we'll just add some loop cuts here to proximity loops to hold this shape, and then subdivide it. Shade it smooth and give it that material. And we could do a cleaner job on this. You notice we've got some areas where there's a little bit of stretching here on the back. I'm not going to worry about them really, just because this is a section of the mesh that we're not really going to see. We're going to be looking pretty much at the front of the headstock, the front of the instrument, and so while we could spend a bunch of time cleaning up the shading and the topology here, it's really not worth the time to do it when you're not going to actually end up seeing it. Alright, so you do want to think, spend a little bit of time thinking about, is it actually worth the time that you're spending on your mesh, because you don't want to waste time on things that nobody eventually will see or care about. So I'm just scaling this to sort of match the other pieces here. And positioning it appropriately. There we go, something like that. And then this I'm just gonna actually extrude, because I notice on this other piece that it sort of goes all the way through, and then this piece on the bottom is a little bit black. So we'll just add a little piece down here. It doesn't need to be, again, super detailed, because this is a portion of the mesh that we're not going to see too much of. But something like that should be okay. And then it's also got this sort of gear. So gears are actually really easy to make in Blender. What I'm going to do is just Shift A, mesh, cylinder, and however many spokes you want on your gear, you want exactly twice as many verts. Oh, my camera battery has died, but I'll finish up this gear and then I'll go charge it. So here I'm going to have, if I do this, say 36, I'll have half that number of spokes. So S, Z, interface mode. I'll click, select, check or deselect, and that's just going to select every second face essentially. And then what we can do is we can, and let's actually scale this down first with RX 90, S to scale, and just sort of position it roughly where it should be, which is about here. And let's see, position it here as well, just so that it's looks pretty correctly spaced, something like that. I'm going to right click and shade smooth, and then I'm going to, with all of these faces selected, search for extrude along normals. Extrude faces along normals. And that's going to extrude them along the face normals, just like this. And then SY if you want the gears to be more narrow, which I will just a little bit. And then I think I extruded mine a little too far, so I'm just looking at my reference here. Something like that is probably fine. And just scale it down. There we go. And just so that the shading is a little bit nicer, I'm just going to add a couple of loop cuts here, because that will affect smooth shading. There we go. And then I'm going to make a material for this. So in all the references I've looked at, this gear is usually a slightly different color than the actual rest of the mechanism. So I'm just gonna go to give it the strap pin material, and then copy it. So copy material, make a new slot, make a new material called gear, and this little drop down here, and hit paste material. And then I can delete that top slot. So now I have a new material on this object that we can change. And I'm going to leave metallic at 1. I'm going to turn the roughness up to like 0.2. And then the base color is going to be sort of a darker goldish color. Something like this. And actually maybe that's a little too dark and a little too saturated. Let's turn the saturation down a little bit. And then I will also actually turn the roughness up to around 0.35. 0.3. Something like that is pretty good. And then I'm also just going to add a bevel in here along the bottom, just to sort of give a slightly nicer looking transition between these parts. And that's looking like a pretty good tuner. So now we just need the cap that goes over top that rotates this gear. And so that, again, is just going to be a cylinder. Scale it down appropriately, RX 90, and just place it, you know, roughly in the correct position here. And I'm just going to give this that strap pin metallic, material the same as the rest of this, and subdivide it and give it some smooth shading and then some loop cuts to hold the geometry. And then I'll just add a little inset here in the center. I'm just going to scale this down and E to extrude, and then put a loop cut around the top and bottom edge of this. And then inset the bottom. There we go. And now I think this actually should be a little bit more rough of material than the rest of this. Just to maybe distinguish this a little bit from everything else that's going on here. So I'll just make a copy of this strap pin material, just like we did before with copy material, and paste into a new slot. And I'm going to call this tuner something, tuner nuts. I don't actually know what that's called. So, and all I'm going to do is just turn up the roughness of this a little bit, just so that it's a slightly different metallic than the rest of this, even though it's vaguely the same color. And if you wanted to, you could you know, you could extrude some pieces of this just to give it, you know, a little more complex geometry if you wanted it to be a little more interesting.